Hi, everyone. Hello. Um, yes, well, I'm very excited to be here sharing this virtual space with you all to discuss archives, the prison movement, the Liberatory Archive documentary. I won't talk too much about, the history of the prison movement because I think my short film that we'll watch and Attica will kind of be a really great introduction for you all there. And it's a lot of history, kind of too much for me to go through. Um, so I'm going to focus more on this notion of the Liberatory Archive today, but I first would love to kind of take a moment to acknowledge how happy I am to be here speaking at my alma mater. Um, Professor Drew didn't mention that, but I was in this class only 2 years ago. I was in the same position as you all as an undergraduate, taking this very same course, learning about the history of documentary film. Um, so it's really great to be here in this space again. I know y'all are in a new building that was not there, a new room that wasn't there when I was an undergrad, but very happy to be here and a part of the campus book project. I also went to a few of those as an undergrad, so it's really an honor to be here today, speaking to you all about my work and sharing this virtual space with you all. Wish I could be there in person, but really happy to be here is the goal of that little spiel I just did. So to, I guess, begin, gonna go to my next slide, to begin thinking about this notion of anti-racism and this amazing and important book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, particularly within the space and landscape of archives, the archive profession, the world of archival work is a very interesting kind of point of conversation and often like paradoxical endeavor, considering the history of archiving and traditional archives being a very inherently oppressive and racist space of its own, often very exclusionary, having policies and practices that are very exclusionary that leave particular histories and narratives and stories out that don't really fit into the larger agenda. So this concept and notion of the Liberatory Archive that I will briefly discuss today is a concept that is very central to my own work, of course, and the work of other abolitionists, activists, scholars. And this concept has been coined in a moment where I think lots of folks are starting to kind of engage in this dialogue around being an anti-racist and what that actually looks like in practice, and how to use the archive as a space for radicalism and as a space for change rather than kind of viewing it as like a static repository of information, right? So some of these areas that we can see today and that we are currently witnessing this dialogue occur within in terms of the space of archives includes many articles and pieces that are being written today. So this is a recent article from June of this year that looks at the ongoing work in the archival realm to approach the practice of archival description and approaching that practice from an anti-racist lens and kind of thinking about how traditional practices of describing the material has been racist and how to kind of correct that and no longer perpetuate it. You have organizations such as Project Stand, which is a collective of colleges and universities across the nation, working to create, I'll quote from their mission statement, to create a centralized digital space highlighting analog and digital collections, emphasizing student activism and marginalized communities. So they're really thinking about the ethics of archiving, student activism, and other vulnerable communities with this sort of backdrop and knowledge of how traditional archiving has been inherently oppressive and has this like racist history, keeping that kind of in mind. If there's anyone here who's interested in archiving or is a student activist, I would highly recommend Project Stand as just a resource to reach out to. I've worked with them a few times on a couple projects and they're a really, really great collective and resource if you're interested in that. And then another example of this anti-racist work being put into action in the archival space is with the National Archives and Record Administration, which I'd like to point out is a government agency. Just interesting note there. They recently created a task force earlier this year in response to the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and everything that occurred last summer. This task force is centered on addressing racism in the archives and informing archivists on how they can address it and prevent it through their own practices and just within their profession. So it's about like 105 pages, I think, this task force that they created this sort of report to the archivist. So this idea of the Liberatory Archive that I keep referencing and mentioning stems from a piece written by Jared Drake, who is a memory worker. He identifies as a memory worker, was formerly an archivist, but no longer identifies as archivist, but uses this term memory worker to kind of dissociate from, like I mentioned, the traditional harmful racist practices of the archiving space. And he is a PhD candidate at Harvard in their social anthropology program. So he, I would say, coined the term in his article that he wrote called Liberatory Archives Towards Belonging and Believing. However, I have to note that he does not, and he's mentioned this, that he doesn't feel like he coined the term because he feels like his work comes from a long lineage of work from scholars and activists that are kind of thinking about archives in this way, such as Michelle Caswell. So this is a quote from Michelle Caswell that he includes in his piece that I referenced. She's a professor in archival studies at UCLA. And in this quote, she's identifying looking towards the future and really keeping the future in mind as a central aspect of the Liberatory Archive. So the quote says, "Through the lens of liberatory archival imaginaries, our work as community-based archivists does not end with the limits of our collection policies, but rather it is an ongoing process of conceptualizing what we want the future to look like." So Drake points out that activists, archivists, memory workers, scholars, filmmakers, documentarians, like whatever you identify yourself as, if you have this interest in kind of using the archive and looking into the Liberatory Archive, the only sort of, I guess, qualifications you need is to believe in these two things, which is one, believe that there is such thing as a future, and two, believe that one's fate in the future is not fixed. So it's very opposite of what the traditional kind of archive profession, we can say, how they think about what makes you any type of archivist, which is going through programming, going through schools, and kind of learning like about the softwares and learning about description practices and policies and whatnot. But within the notion of the Liberatory Archive, we're kind of detaching ourselves from that. And as long as you believe that there is one future and that our fate is not fixed, then you are on your way to engaging in liberatory archival work. So this is how I kind of started to begin thinking about a lot of the media work that I was engaging in and the work that I was and am currently doing, which, as Dr. Drew kind of briefly mentioned, thinks about this intersection between, you know, looking at the nature and roots of the prison movement and prison resistance and how the representation of that resistance and history plays into this kind of perpetuation of racism, perpetuation of oppression, essentially, and how the archive is used as a tool to do that. So I've done a lot of work kind of looking into traditional archive spaces, news, like archives and things like that, and looking as like opposite to that and contrary to that into like the grassroots organizations and movements that have been collecting a lot of material over the years, but maybe haven't done anything with it in terms of digitizing it. And my introduction to that, like I mentioned, I was an undergrad here, took classes with Dr. Drew, and I was also a McNair scholar. And as I was doing my research on the roots of the prison movement, Dr. Drew pretty much introduced me to this expansive, immense analog archive that he has that contains various social movements, liberation movements, and particularly the prison movement of the 1970s, to be specific. So as I began engaging with these analog materials and thinking through with Professor Drew how we can rethink ideas of public domain and access to these materials, and also at the same time digitizing and scanning the materials, I began to get more tapped in simultaneously with other organizers who were thinking about abolition and thinking about the prison movement, other, I guess we can say, folks who participated in the movement from the 1970s. So engaging in interviews with people and doing oral histories And as I was working on all of this at the same time, I was like, how can I kind of produce a digital repository so that I can no longer just think about the Liberatory archive in theory, but like think about it in action. So I created Black August Archives, which is a multimedia archive that is available online, and it's a work in progress, but it is dedicated to preserving, documenting, and disseminating these histories of prison resistance that have been left out from these traditional archives. Um, and not only left out, but intentionally erased at certain moments. So during my own practice and thinking about how I implement the Liberatory archive, I'm often thinking through ideas and kind of representation of inclusion versus exclusion, thinking about presenting this analog material and in what format, thinking about how to create educational resources and how to kind of put out these oral histories that I've been doing with folks so that it can ultimately serve as an educational resource, but a space for people to, I guess, engage with the material and think about how they themselves can impact future trajectories of liberation, and think through these ideas, and also think through what they can do in action and use it as a resource, whether they're organizing, whether they're a scholar, whether like whatever realm you kind of currently find yourself in, the archive can still be of assistance to any individual essentially. So finally, one of the main aspects, I think, for Black August archives and a lot of other liberatory archives is thinking about ways to repurpose the archive. So of course, in a lot of documentary films, they contain a plethora of archival material, and we may not be very cognizant of like thinking about what was the process that went into I guess, uncovering this material and putting it in the film. But that is one way that archives are repurposed and no longer just looked at as being something of the past, right? So that's one of the main elements of Black August archives, is thinking about how to keep all these histories alive, rather than viewing it as something of the past, and thinking of ways we can integrate it into our present as we think about future trajectories of liberation. So when I was tasked this past summer, I think it was, I took a course here at USC called Nonfiction Cinema. I was tasked with creating a short piece. I decided to focus on my own research interest, which obviously is the prison movement, but particularly I wanted to kind of dive into Attica, the Attica massacre and the events that occurred, which is often understudied and undermentioned, but it's becoming more in recent years discussed, especially with the 50th anniversary being this year, in September, of the massacre. So I was like, I think this is a really interesting project for me to kind of work on. And I was searching for anything online that was different than what I had already seen about Attica. And I came across this really interesting and fairly new archive called the Attica Massacre Archive. And I saw all these images of Attica that I had never seen before throughout all of my own research and kind of interviews I had done with folks and so on and so forth. And it was then that I discovered through perusing this site that the archive had never been seen before. And it was a part of a radical lawyer by the name of Elizabeth Fink. It was she was a lawyer for the Attica brothers after the Attica massacre. It was a part of her collection that she actually admits to stealing from the prosecution of during the Attica brothers trial. So she stole a lot of these images that the state continues to claim does not exist. And she held on to it for many years, up until her death. And her family friend, Michael Hull, who was also a filmmaker, decided after hearing from Elizabeth for many years that this material needed to be out and the public needed to know about it. He decided to digitize it and make it into this amazing online archive that is free of access to anyone, atticamassacre.com. Also would like to plug in there that he has an amazing documentary that just came out called Betrayal at Attica that's available on HBO Max that puts a lot of this archive and Elizabeth Fink's kind of oral history into context in relation to Attica and why it's really important for us to pay attention to what happened in Attica in 1971. So I would definitely recommend that. So I called him up. We had a great conversation. He said I could use anything from the archive, like it's public domain. So it was really great to connect with another person alongside, Dr. Drew and other folks that I was connecting with, but another filmmaker who was like, I believe in public domain and like free access to all archival material. Like, here's my archive, like do with it what you will. So I used many images from this archive. For my short piece that we'll show momentarily, I reached out to Cinder Firestone, who is the director of the 1974 documentary Attica, which you'll be watching later on today. And she was also very happy to let me use anything from her 1974 documentary. So another individual that was very just on the same page with me about using this material for education purposes and not kind of holding on to it or having ideas of ownership of it. So from all of those kind of repositories and archival spaces, I created a piece called Bloody Monday. That is a short piece on Attica, kind of like a remix, I guess I could call it, of the events that occurred there using mostly the Attica Massacre archive. And I specifically wanted to think about the ways in which the archive, once again, can be repurposed, but repurposed to make an argument about Attica and how we should move forward from it. And I also wanted to, once again, use the archive to kind of speak to these issues of oppression and repression that we're still witnessing today. So that's like my whole spiel, I guess, about my work. And I guess without further ado, Dr. Drew will be showing my.
We're going to look at the piece that you made out of that archival material. Is there anything you want to say about it up front at all, about the content? Shocking? Warning?
I do have a content warning at the beginning of the piece, but I guess I can verbally give it as well. It is very graphic, which I know maybe after when we do the Q&A, there might be questions that come up, which is about maybe trauma porn and things like that, which I'm also very happy to address, but it is very graphic. That is on purpose because, like I mentioned, this material, New York State has denied having any existence for so many years. So myself, Michael Hull, and others are very adamant about making sure that people see these images and these horrific images and footage to kind of make sure, number one, Attica never happens again, but also so that we are kind of aware of the, I guess, the intersections between what we're witnessing today, which I think Betrayal at Attica, the film I mentioned, does a greater job at kind of explicating those intersections than my short piece is only 10 minutes. But yes, it is very graphic. So if you feel like it's too much, you can close your eyes or leave the room, or if it's triggering for you because of whatever reason, I totally understand. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to engaging with y'all about the piece and hearing your thoughts or questions.
Okay, so we're going to show this. It's about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards.